Joining us on the line is Rachel Greszler. She's a research fellow at the Grover M. Hermann Center for the Federal Budget with the Heritage Foundation. She focuses on retirement and labor policies like Social Security and disability insurance and pensions, but she is also an expert on police unions. Rachel, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So there's been a lot of talk about what can be done in the aftermath of George Floyd's death that can reform police practices. Some people on the right have suggested things like reducing qualified immunity. And one of the more popular suggestions on the right is breaking police unions. So why don't you explain what police unions do, what's good about them, what's bad about them, and how can they be reformed such that they're not protecting bad cops?
Yep. So part of the issue with police unions, they're very similar to other public sector unions in many ways in terms of negotiating pay and compensation packages. But the difference really is the level of management authority that has been given to the unions. And my understanding is this started kind of in the 80s and times when there were recessions and cities couldn't afford to give pay raises or other benefit increases. They would instead negotiate with the union to take control of certain management sides of things and give them more authority instead. And that over time, this has really contributed to a problem where police chiefs kind of have their hands tied in many situations, and they can't enforce the accountability and the discipline measures that are necessary to actually run their departments as they need to and to have the appropriate discipline measures in place. Oftentimes, they end up firing an officer, which is not an easy thing to do to begin with, and then they're forced to reinstate them. And so this leads to being able to keep the bad cops on the street. And, overwhelmingly, police are heroes, and they are out there putting their lives on the line, protecting the communities in which they live and serve. And yet we just have some bad apples out there. But when those bad apples are allowed to remain and there's no real way to get rid of them, that's when you see these problems.
So when it comes to police unions, there's been a lot of talk about defunding the police. One of the examples that people have been using is Camden. I'm always amused by that because Camden obviously got rid of its city police and then immediately handed it over to the county. And then the county has actually doubled the number of police officers and made the police force less racially representative. So what sort of measures could actually be taken in terms of taking action against police unions specifically? And also, I find it highly ironic that so many members of the Democratic Party seem kind of warm to getting rid of police unions, but have nothing whatsoever to say about teachers' unions who do exactly the same thing for bad teachers.
Yeah. So, I think at a minimum, these local and city officials who are really the ones who are in charge of this issue and at the root of the contracts, they need to step up and they need to renegotiate their police union contracts to remove any of the provisions that are hamstringing their department's ability to enforce accountability and discipline. And so it needs to start at the local level. No matter what happens, state or even federal level, you can implement these reforms and you can say that we're creating a national registry or we're banning these types of uses of force. But if those uses of force never get reported or those claims of misconduct and complaints from citizens don't ever see the light of day because of provisions of the union contract, that does nothing. And so it needs to start there. But this also does get to the issue of public sector unions in general. And, the reason that even FDR was opposed to unions to begin with is he deemed them, quote, unthinkable and intolerable because they might obstruct the operations of government. Because when it's the public sector, you really only have one side coming to the negotiating table, and that is the union, whether they're representing the police or the teachers or somebody else. Taxpayers don't come and sit there. Politicians might come and sit there, but the problem then is that the politicians are often receiving donations from those very unions. And there have been plenty of cases when politicians have sought police reforms, and then the union has launched campaigns to get them unelected. And so there's a real conflict of interest here with those public sector unions just in general.
Now, one of the other aspects of this that nobody has been willing to talk about in American public life is the fact these public sector unions are blowing out our deficit. The fact is that the state of California has probably trillions of dollars in unfunded liability because of exactly the sort of contracts that you're mentioning. I do find it interesting that Democrats really are not saying a lot about police unions at this point. So the Republicans seem a little bit queasy about qualified immunity, but Democrats seem very queasy about doing anything about police unions. Meanwhile, they're talking about defunding the police to essentially set up charter school programs for cops. Basically, they're going to go out and outsource police to non-police union officials. So how exactly do they square that circle?
Yeah, well, I mean, it needs to be talked about. You had President Barack Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and the only mention of unions in there was that they needed a seat at the table in the reform process. But history shows us that when unions have power over accountability and discipline, and they have that seat at the table, that typically results in less accountability and less discipline, and it poses a risk to community protection. And so that's not the answer. I have seen, fortunately and hopefully, there have been organizations, left-leaning ones, the American Civil Liberties Union, pointing out that, historically the police union contracts have been vehicles for rolling back accountability and transparency and civilian oversight. And there are certainly academic studies and other groups that are out there that are mentioning this, but it's not what we're seeing in the mainstream media. It's all about, what can the policymakers do to confront these problems. But it does turn into a budget issue as well. And, you mentioned California and how they're becoming bankrupt. It's the same thing in other states as well. Illinois is a prime example. But one of the successes in Camden, New Jersey, was that it was facing not only the safety crisis, but also a budget deficit crisis. And so they were able to pay for only 175 police officers at a cost of over $180,000 per officer. But when they essentially fired all the unionized police officers and then rehired them as county employees, they cut their costs down to under $100,000 per officer. And now they have a force of 400. And they've seen a 2/3 reduction in the homicide rate, a 95% reduction in complaints against officers because they're not part of that union and they're able to negotiate directly with the individuals instead of with the union, and no taxpayer representative there, what the compensation and the benefit packages will be.
Well, again, the public sector unions and police unions are among them, have created an enormous problem for the country. I appreciate you speaking out about it. Rachel Greszler, research fellow at the Grover M. Hermann Center for Federal Budget with the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Ben.